March 3, 1944. A thin stream of smoke curled from the kitchen chimney of a prisoner-of-war camp in Texas, carrying with it the unmistakable aroma of fried ham. The smell drifted through the crisp morning air, over fences topped with barbed wire, through the watchtowers where young American soldiers shifted in their boots, and into the barracks where German women sat in silence, their stomachs tight with hunger and memory. What began as a simple American breakfast, eggs cracking against the griddle, meat sizzling in hot grease, became, for those behind the wire, a cruelly tender reminder of the lives they had left behind, and the losses they could not escape. The guards thought little of it. To them, this was routine, part of the steady rhythm of military life. Eggs, ham, bread, and coffee, fuel for another long day of watching over strangers in a dusty corner of America. But for the prisoners, especially the women who had survived rationing, bombing raids, and the long voyage across the Atlantic, this meal was not ordinary. It was extraordinary. The smell of ham alone was enough to reduce some of them to tears. They had not tasted such meat in years. In German cities, the war had turned ham into a ghost, a food spoken of wistfully but rarely seen, let alone eaten. America was, to them, another world. When they had first been captured, some while fleeing across North Africa, others pulled from merchant ships, and still others deported from Latin America because of suspected German ties, they imagined they would be mistreated, perhaps starved, punished for being on the wrong side of the war. Propaganda had taught them that Americans were ruthless, decadent, eager to humiliate their enemies. Instead, they arrived in well-organized camps where the guards addressed them with clipped professionalism, where beds were issued with blankets, and where food appeared in regular intervals, hot and plentiful compared to what they had known. Still, the smell of fried ham carried an unbearable weight. Hunger was part of it, of course. War had carved hollows into their cheeks, left their bodies thin, their hands restless for food. But more than hunger, it was memory. One woman, a seamstress from Bremen, thought instantly of her mother's Sunday table, where a single slice of ham, before the war, had been laid proudly on a platter beside steaming potatoes. Another remembered a husband who had died on the Eastern Front, and how he used to sneak scraps of meat from the butcher's shop to share with her. To smell ham again was to feel the sharp ache of absence. The guards noticed the women's reactions with a kind of awkward sympathy. Some of the soldiers were no older than the prisoners, barely out of high school, raised on farms where hog butchering was an autumn ritual. To them, food was sustenance, not symbol. But as they watched German women turn their faces away, covering their eyes or clutching at their skirts as if bracing against a storm of memory, the soldiers realized that breakfast could wound as deeply as any weapon. The Geneva Convention required the United States to feed its prisoners adequately, and America, determined to distinguish itself from its enemies, followed those rules with care. Each prisoner received 3 meals a day, inspected by the Red Cross, often better than what civilians at home could manage with ration book. A bitter irony lingered in this fact. Outside the wire, American families sometimes queued in long lines for butter or sugar, while inside, their supposed enemies ate bacon, potatoes, and bread without fear of shortage. It was a truth that would spark frustration among locals, but for the women imprisoned, it inspired both relief and guilt. The camp itself was orderly, almost eerily so. Rows of barracks stretched across the flat Texas land, each one identical, built from wood and tar paper, surrounded by fences that glinted in the sun. Beyond the wire, fields extended endlessly, dotted with cattle and cotton, a landscape that seemed untouched by the chaos consuming Europe. For women who had lived under the thunder of bombs in Hamburg or Frankfurt, the quiet was overwhelming. The silence carried its own weight, and into that silence drifted the sense of American life. Fried ham, fresh bread, black coffee. Each aroma was both comfort and torment, promising sustenance but stirring guilt that their families across the ocean starved without them. Letters home often became confessions. One woman wrote of the shame she felt eating well while her sister scoured ruins for potatoes. Another admitted that she had gained weight in captivity. her cheeks filling out even as she imagined her children's faces growing thinner in bomb shelters. To describe the food was almost indecent, like bragging. Yet they could not help but mention it, because the abundance was so stark, so inescapable, that silence itself felt dishonest. And still, the ham lingered. Even among the variety of meals, stews, bread, vegetables, it was ham that seemed to haunt them most. It was not only meat but symbol, a link to the Germany they remembered, a reminder of Sundays when families gathered, when life felt whole. To smell it in America, while confined, was to feel the sharp edge of contrast, abundance just out of reach, freedom replaced by fences, home reduced to memory. The first days in the camp set the tone for all that followed. There were no beatings, no starvation, no cruelty beyond the unavoidable fact of captivity. Instead, there was a strange mix of comfort and grief, of safety and longing. The women were safe from bombs, yes, but they were also severed from their families. They were well fed, yet burdened by guilt for each bite. Every kindness from the guards was both a relief and a reminder that kindness could not erase absence. Some prisoners reacted with defiance, refusing to show gratitude. Others, caught off guard by the decency of their captors, softened, even laughed at small jokes exchanged across the language barrier. But beneath all responses ran the same undercurrent. The war had ripped them from their lives, and now, in a land of plenty, they were confronted daily with the contrast between what they had and what their families lacked. The smell of ham crystallized this conflict. It was not just food. It was a memory made flesh, carried on the air, unavoidable and sharp. It brought hunger, yes, but more than that, it brought grief. It reminded them that while they sat in relative comfort, Europe was burning. And so, that morning in March, as the cook scraped sizzling meat from the griddle and slid it onto the plates of guards and staff, the German women behind the wire bowed their heads. Some cried openly. Others clenched their jaws, refusing to let tears show. The guards shifted uneasily, pretending not to notice. It was, after all, only breakfast. But for the women, it was a moment of reckoning, the first of many in captivity. What they could not yet know was that this tension, the clash of abundance and guilt, of comfort and captivity, would not fade. It would grow, shaping their days, their memories, and even their beliefs about the war itself. The smell of fried ham was only the beginning. The days in the Texas camp unfolded with a rhythm that was both predictable and surreal, a life suspended between war and peace. At dawn, the sound of a bugle or the bark of a guard's command stirred the women from narrow cots lined in rows. They rose in silence, folding blankets with precise hands, brushing hair quickly, adjusting the plain dresses or work clothes issued to them. Outside, the sun already pressed heat into the ground, the dust rising with every step toward roll call. The guards counted them briskly, clipboards in hand, rifles slung across shoulders, before dispersing them to the duties that filled their long hours. For the German women, the work varied, sewing uniforms, mending sheets, peeling endless piles of potatoes in the kitchen, or tending small infirmaries. It was not hard labor compared to factories or fields, but it carried the peculiar sting of futility. They were kept busy not to build something of meaning, but to maintain the mechanics of captivity. Even so, the women worked with diligence, partly out of pride, partly to keep despair at bay. Hands needed something to do when minds longed for home. Meals broke the monotony, and again the contrast cut sharp. Breakfasts of eggs, toast, sometimes ham or bacon. Lunches of stews, beans, meatloaf, fresh bread. Dinners with potatoes, vegetables, and occasionally fruit. To American eyes, it was modest fare, bound by wartime rationing. To the prisoners, it was extravagant. Inspectors from the Red Cross noted that German POWs in the U.S. received more calories daily than many American civilians. One guard, half joking, half bitter, muttered that, "The Nazis in here eat better than my kids at home." It was an irony not lost on the prisoners themselves, who chewed every bite with both gratitude and guilt. The women often whispered about this irony late at night, their voices low in the barrack. Some laughed softly at the strangeness of eating white bread every day, when their families back home stretched sawdust into flour. Others fell quiet, ashamed, their thoughts turning to mothers, husbands, children still in Germany. One seamstress confessed that she wrapped a crust of bread in a cloth each night, as if saving it for a child who was not there. She knew it would harden by morning, yet she could not stop herself. Guards observed these rituals with unease. They were young, many no older than the women they watched, and in quieter moments, some admitted they could not hate them. These prisoners were not faceless enemies charging across battlefields but women who mended shirts, hummed lullabies, braided one another's hair in the evenings. Still, the barbed wire stood, a reminder that kindness had limits, and trust was not part of their orders. Life behind the wire was not without its odd moments of humanity. On hot afternoons, American jazz and swing music drifted from radios in the guard post. At first the German women scowled, muttering about the decadence of American culture. Yet, over time, toes tapped beneath benches, lips mouthed half-remembered English words, and melodies slipped past defenses. One night, when a record skipped on in the mood, laughter rippled across the barracks, surprising even themselves. Music, it seemed, was harder to imprison than bodies. But the comfort of music or food could not erase the weight of absence. Letters arrived sporadically, often censored, black ink blotting out phrases deemed dangerous. A letter from Hamburg might speak of nights spent in cellars as bombs fell, or of long queues for thin soup. One woman received word that her daughter had died of pneumonia, and for weeks afterward she sat silently at meals, pushing away bread untouched. The guards noticed, the other women noticed, but no one could bridge the distance between abundance and grief. The smell of fried ham still filled the mornings, but now it mixed with the salt of unspoken sorrow. The conflict deepened in small ways. Some women resented the abundance, feeling it mocked them, as if every plate of food was a reminder of betrayal. Others embraced it, deciding that to survive was its own duty, even if survival came with guilt. Divisions emerged, between those who clung fiercely to old loyalties and those who softened, acknowledging that not all Americans were monsters. In whispered conversations, some admitted that the camp challenged the propaganda they had once believed. If America was the land of cruelty, why were they fed so well, treated with a strange sort of dignity? Still, there were flashes of defiance. When guards distributed rations of coffee, a few women refused, claiming it was poisoned decadence. They stood tall, refusing the mug, but later, when the smell lingered, some quietly asked for a sip. Pride was powerful, but the human craving for warmth was stronger. These small rebellions mattered less to the guards than to the women themselves, who measured dignity in ounces and gestures. The routines could almost lull one into thinking this was an ordinary village, with its work, meals, music, and gossip. But the barbed wire shimmered in the sunlight, always there, cutting the illusion. Beyond it stretched America, vast fields, cattle, trains rumbling past. The prisoners could see the ordinary life of freedom but could not touch it. That distance made the simplest things, an orange, a cigarette, the sound of children laughing in the distance, ache with intensity. It was in these contrasts that the central struggle took shape. Comfort clashed with longing, dignity with humiliation, gratitude with guilt. The women lived better in captivity than their families lived in freedom, and that truth gnawed at them with each bite of bread. Even kindness from guards became complicated. One soldier, barely 20, once handed an apple to a woman who looked especially weary. She accepted it, murmured thanks, and later cried alone, torn between gratitude and shame. An apple should not carry such weight, and yet in war, even fruit became a symbol of everything lost. The camp became a world of paradoxes. They were safe from bombs, yet trapped. They were nourished, yet consumed by guilt. They were treated with fairness, yet stripped of freedom. And above all, they were haunted by a scent, fried ham, rich and tantalizing, drifting every morning like an echo of a homeland they might never see again. For the guards, it remained routine. They cracked eggs, fried meat, stacked trays. For the women, every aroma was a reminder that survival came at a price. The burden of eating well while loved ones starved across the ocean. That burden sat heavy, unspoken but undeniable. And as weeks turned into months, this tension sharpened into something deeper. Food no longer symbolized only comfort or guilt. It began to erode certainty itself. Beliefs, loyalties, and identities bent beneath the weight of daily abundance. The war outside raged on, but within the fences, another kind of war unfolded, silent, intimate, fought not with weapons but with memories and smells. One morning, as the familiar scent of ham wafted across the camp, a woman whispered to another, "Perhaps America is not what we were told." It was a dangerous thought, one that could not be spoken loudly, but once released, it hung in the air heavier than the smoke from the griddle. The mornings became almost ritual in their cruelty, though no guard intended it that way. The camp kitchen came alive before sunrise, cooks rattling pans, pouring coffee, cracking eggs onto hot iron. And always there was ham. The scent carried farther than the guards realized, slipping through open windows, drifting beyond the mess hall, riding the cool Texas wind until it reached the barracks. For the German women, it struck like a memory intruding on the present, invisible yet inescapable. They could not touch it, yet it touched them, cutting deep into the silence of captivity. Some mornings, the women rose before the bugle just to stand by the barracks windows, eyes closed, breathing in that smell. One whispered that it felt like a prayer, though one that offered no comfort. Another said it reminded her of Christmas in Dresden, long before the bombs. The scent awakened not hunger alone but the ache of remembrance, of kitchens with checkered cloths, of fathers carving meat, of children laughing around tables. Each whiff brought those scenes alive, and then reminded them how distant they were, how shattered by the war. A seamstress named Lotte once told the others that the smell nearly broke her. She had not eaten pork since 1942, when the last of her family's savings had been exchanged for a single smoked joint on the black market. The day she first inhaled ham in Texas, she felt as though her body betrayed her, salivating with desire even as her heart clenched with grief. She wept into her hands, ashamed of wanting what she could not share with the son she had left in Bremen. That night she lay awake replaying the sound of him asking, "Mama, when will we eat meat again?" She had no answer then, and captivity gave her none now. The women spoke of this often in hushed tones, as if confessing sins. Some admitted they hated themselves for craving food so fiercely while imagining their families scavenging turnips from frozen field. Others described guilt at savoring even the simplest stew, knowing it was more than their loved ones might see in week. The smell of ham became shorthand for that guilt, a scent that signaled both plenty and absence, both comfort and sorrow. It was a paradox too sharp to hold in silence, yet too painful to fully speak aloud. The guards sometimes noticed. One young soldier, from a farm in Iowa, joked that he wished he could trade places. He was tired of ham, tired of eggs, tired of the monotony. His words were meant lightly, but they cut deep. For him, it was boredom. For the prisoners, it was the ache of paradise glimpsed but withheld. When the women heard him grumble, some turned away, unwilling to let him see their faces tremble with envy. To long for what another discarded so casually was humiliation layered atop grief. Irony became the camp's most persistent companion. The German women were prisoners, yet they ate regularly, safely, while free women in Germany rationed carrots into watery soups. They were strangers in a foreign land, yet they were safe from the bombs that had leveled their neighborhood. They were fed, yet they carried guilt with every swallow. The ham embodied this irony, plentiful, fragrant, mocking in its abundance. Inspectors noted the prisoners' health improving steadily. Red Cross reports described women gaining weight, cheeks filling, color returning. Photographs taken years later showed some unrecognizable, transformed by steady meals into figures far from the hollow-eyed shadows who had first arrived. Yet within the camp, this visible change only deepened the unease. How could they grow stronger here while imagining their families wasting away in ruined cities? Strength itself became a source of shame. One guard, curious, asked a woman why the smell of ham affected them so. She tried to explain but found words failing. How to tell a farm boy from Nebraska that the aroma was not just food, but memory? That it carried with it the laughter of children who might no longer live, the warmth of homes that no longer stood, the taste of life before the world collapsed? In the end, she told him only that it reminded them of home. The guard nodded, perhaps thinking he understood. He did not. The kitchen became both the heart of the camp and its cruelest reminder. Women assigned to work there endured the torment most directly, handling food they might never taste, carrying trays past guards who ate first. Some found ways to cope, humming while they scrubbed pots, distracting themselves with routine. Others broke under the weight, sneaking crumbs into aprons, not from greed but from the impossible urge to share with ghosts they could not reach. To smell, to see, to hold food in their hands, knowing it was plentiful here while absent at home, was a daily test of the soul. And yet, the scent worked its slow transformation. At first, it sharpened grief. Later, it began to unravel certainty. The ham did not fit with the picture of America painted by propaganda. These were not the starving, decadent barbarians promised in speeches back home. Instead, Americans seemed to overflow with food, with music, with a kind of casual generosity that unsettled the prisoners. The smell itself became evidence, proof that life here was not as cruel as they had been told, even if it still cut them deeply. This contradiction gnawed at loyalties. Some clung harder to defiance, insisting that abundance was only a trick meant to weaken them. Others began to soften, wondering aloud what else they had been told that was not true. The war raged far away, but within the fences, the scent of breakfast was undoing convictions as surely as bombs undid cities. In time, the ham became more than food, more than memory. It was a symbol of survival itself. Women who had once wept at its aroma learned to steel themselves, to breathe deeply and bear the ache. They told themselves they must endure, not just for their own lives but for the possibility of returning home one day with something to offer, even if it was only the strength gained in captivity. Each morning became a test, each breath an act of endurance. Still, there were moments when endurance cracked. A woman once dropped her sewing needle at the smell of ham drifting through the barracks. She bent to pick it up and stayed there, crouched on the floor, unable to rise, her shoulders shaking silently. Another time, a guard overheard prisoners singing softly in German as they worked, voices weaving memories into melody, trying to turn the smell into something less painful, something almost holy. The smell lingered through everything, binding days together. It became the measure of time, the constant thread in the fabric of captivity. And with every breath, the women felt the paradox tighten, comfort intertwined with grief, safety shadowed by guilt. On one quiet morning, as smoke rose and the air filled again with that familiar scent, a prisoner whispered to the woman beside her, "If we can cry over ham, what else might we discover here?" The words hung heavy, more dangerous than she intended. For what lay beneath them was not just sorrow, but a dawning realization that captivity itself was reshaping who they were, and perhaps what they believed. Years later, many of the women would remember the smell before they remembered the fences. The barbed wire, the towers, the guards, all faded with time. But the scent of fried ham lingered in memory like a ghost, rising unbidden whenever they thought of America. It became the strange marker of their captivity, not the chains of cruelty they had feared, but the chains of plenty that unsettled their hearts in ways they never expected. As months turned to years, survival inside the camp shifted from mere endurance to a reckoning of identity. The women began to realize that they were changing, not only in body, with fuller cheeks and steadier strength, but in mind. The abundance chipped away at the old certainties that Nazi speeches had hammered into them. If America was the brutal monster they had been told, why did its soldiers treat them with professionalism? Why did its cooks prepare meals with care? Why did the air each morning fill with a scent that spoke of home rather than hatred? This was not the war they had been taught to expect. For some, the change came slowly, almost reluctantly. They would eat in silence, remembering bombed neighborhoods, refusing to smile at guards who joked in broken German. Yet over time, laughter did creep in, sparked by something as small as a radio playing Glenn Miller or a guard's awkward attempt to pronounce a German word. Prison life blurred the line between enemy and fellow human. The smell of breakfast, once a torment, began to represent survival. It was no longer just a reminder of absence, but also proof that they were alive to remember at all. Letters continued to arrive, filled with news of hunger, devastation, and death. A mother described stretching turnips for soup. A sister wrote of standing in endless lines for bread. These words cut deeply, and guilt persisted, yet the women began to understand that their survival, their strength, might matter when they returned. Food no longer felt like betrayal. It became preparation for a future they could not yet see. In this way, the ham became both torment and gift, a reminder of sorrow but also a symbol of resilience. The guards, too, noticed the transformation. They saw women who had once glared at them soften, if only slightly. They overheard conversations about the strangeness of America, its contradictions, how a country that dropped bombs on their cities also fed them 3 meals a day in captivity. The guards themselves wrestled with irony. One wrote home, confessing that he sometimes envied the prisoners' meals compared to rationed portions his wife managed for their children. The war created absurdities at every turn, but none so sharp as this reversal of fortune. Over time, the camps became unlikely classrooms of perception. The women observed America not through propaganda but through the rhythm of daily life. The fairness of inspections, the presence of books in camp libraries, the music drifting across the yard. They learned English words, sometimes from dictionaries, sometimes from guards who offered them half in jest. And always food anchored these lessons. The smell of ham was not merely sustenance. It was a contradiction too large to ignore. It forced them to question what else had been false, what else might be reimagined. Some prisoners carried these lessons home after repatriation. Post-war interviews revealed that many returned with a softened view of America, some even expressing admiration for its abundance and organization. A few eventually emigrated back, drawn by the memory of safety in captivity. For them, the smell of ham became not just a memory of hunger, but a scent tied to transformation, to the recognition that enemies could also be human, and that survival sometimes required a willingness to let old certainties dissolve. Yet guilt never vanished. Survivors confessed decades later that they had never fully reconciled eating so well while their families starved. The memory of each bite came with a shadow. A woman from Hamburg admitted she still dreamed of her children watching her eat from across an invisible divide. Another confessed that, whenever she cooked ham after the war, she felt compelled to pause, to remember those mornings behind the wire. Memory itself became a battleground, where gratitude and grief fought endlessly without resolution. The legacy of those camps did not rest only with the prisoners. For the guards, too, the experience lingered. They had watched women cry over the smell of food, had seen hunger and longing made visible through tears. They learned, perhaps earlier than most, that war was not only fought with bullets but with memories, with absences, with something as small as a plate of meat on a cold morning. Some guards wrote in their memoirs that the image of weeping women never left them, shaping their understanding of mercy and cruelty in ways that lasted their lives. By the end of the war, the paradox of captivity had reshaped both sides. The women had survived, nourished in body, unsettled in spirit, carrying memories that would color their stories for decades. The guards had learned that power was not always about force, that sometimes the smallest details, an apple, a loaf of bread, a strip of ham, revealed more about humanity than weapons ever could. And together they had shared a strange, fleeting world where comfort and grief were inseparable, where abundance was both blessing and burden. When the women finally left, boarding trains that would take them back to a shattered Europe. The air in Texas smelled again of breakfast. They inhaled it one last time, some weeping openly, others silent, all carrying the paradox with them. The fences receded, the towers vanished behind the horizon, but the scent would never leave. It became their unchosen inheritance, a reminder that captivity had given them life even as it deepened their sorrow. Years later, grandchildren would ask about America, about the camps, about the war. Some women spoke plainly, others remained silent. But among those who did answer, the same image returned again and again. Not the barbed wire, not the guards with rifles, not the endless dust of Texas. Instead, they described a morning smell, heavy and irresistible, that rose with the dawn. A smell that brought both tears and survival. A smell that was home and not home, memory and wound, cruelty and kindness at once. And so, the legacy of those years was not written only in history books, not only in Red Cross reports or government files. It lived in kitchens decades later, when a pan of ham sizzled and an old woman paused, eyes distant, tears brimming, caught between past and present. It lived in the way survivors described America with ambivalence, enemy and savior, captor and provider. It lived in the memory of guards who had watched silently, unsure whether to turn away or to understand. What began as a smell carried across barbed wire ended as something far greater, a story of paradox, survival, and transformation. The ham was never just food. It was the weight of memory itself, the strange legacy of a war that reshaped not only nations but the intimate lives of those caught within it. And yet, behind every memory lay an unanswered question, one that lingered long after the fences fell. Was it the abundance that changed them, or the realization that kindness could exist in the most unexpected places?